Hello and welcome to this Silverstripe screencast. This tutorial is all about front-end forms. We're going to be adding a new feature that allows users to post comments on our articles. So let's get into what we're going to cover here. First, we'll talk about how Silverstripe handles forms. Then we'll add a form to a template. And then we will create a comment object that the form will work with. We'll move on to handling the form submission. And lastly, we'll do some validation. So as I said, this lesson is all about front-end forms, and that's a very important distinction to make because we've actually been working with forms since the very beginning of these lessons. They've just been in the CMS. So whenever we're editing data in the back end, we're using a form. The main difference is that in the CMS, only a small part of that form is actually exposed through the getCMSFields function, whereas with front-end forms, you really have control over everything. So when you think about how a framework might deal with form creation, you might imagine a simple object that sort of takes an array of form fields and ultimately dumps out some HTML with a render method or something like that. But Silverstripe doesn't work that way with static forms. In Silverstripe, one of the most distinguishing features of the way forms are handled is that they're first-class citizens. They are intelligent objects that work with all the other big players in the request cycle. So they're dealing with controllers and models and views and all those things in a very configurable and intelligent way. So that's all a lot of explanation, but let's just look at what we're going to be dealing with here by creating a simple form. So I'll show you some code. So this code would be placed in a controller, and you can see we're creating a contact form, so we call the method contact form. Again, the convention of using upper camel case because it's going to be called on the template. We invoke the create method on the form, and now we're in the constructor. This first argument, controller, so a form should be generated by and handled by a controller. So a controller plays a very important role with a form, and that's why it's the first argument here. The benefits of a form being bound to a controller are very impressive, and we'll see some of them in just a little bit when we start working with real forms. Because the controller that creates the form usually handles it as well, 99% of the time, the first argument for your form constructor is going to be $this, because you're passing in the current controller, right? So this second argument, contact form, is a string, and it represents the name of the method that creates this form. This is pretty odd, right? It's a bit unconventional to be dealing with class methods as strings, but this really is a key feature. The form will submit to a URL that calls this method, which means that we'll get the fully configured form object to inspect and manipulate when handling the submission. We'll be able to add error messages, set the state of the form, and even manipulate the fields based on the user's submission. Because this argument always describes the name of the function that we're currently in, you can simply use the PHP constant function for this argument. So next we have a field list, and that just contains all of the form fields that accept user input. This is exactly what we've been dealing with getCMSFields. Next is a field list object that contains all the form actions or buttons that submit a form. Oftentimes you're only going to have one action. Sometimes you'll have multiple actions, such as in the CMS you have save, save and publish. Those are all actions. So the first argument of the form action itself is a method on the controller that will be invoked when the form is submitted. So that's going to be your form handler. In this case, the method is called sendContactForm, so we would have a method on the controller called sendContactForm. Lastly, we have this required fields object. It takes a list of form field names that it will validate. Now, validation, as you know, is an infinitely complex beast. In this case, we're doing very basic validation that simply ensures that the fields contain valid data. Each form field validates itself, so an email field will validate differently than a number field or a text field. So let's look at how we handle the submission of this example form. In the field list of actions for a form, we did specify a single form action that maps to a method called sendContactForm. So let's look at what that sendContactForm method might do. Again, the following code should be in any controller class. So our form handler method is given two parameters. It's got a data array that comes in first, and that contains all the form field names mapped to their values. It's very similar to what you would get out of a _post variable or _request. The next one is $form, and this is the form object that the contact form method gave us. So the contact form rendered this to the template, but it's also giving it back to us in the submission. So remember, we had to specify the name of the function in our form constructor. This is why. Our form handler now has full access to that form, which is immeasurably useful. You're going to find out. So that's a really high-level view of how forms work. Now we'll look at implementing a working front-end form in our project. So let's look at our article page.ss template again, and we'll find the comment form near the bottom of the page. Let's try our best to replicate that form in our controller. So I'm going to write the comment form method here. I first create the form. I pass in this for the controller. And now I've got those three fields, name, email, and comment. I'm going to leave the title part of those deliberately empty because we set all the titles through placeholders. And then, of course, we have the form action, which I'm just going to call handle comment. I'll give it a label of post comment, and we'll require all three fields. So I did mention that we left all those title fields blank because we're using placeholders, and we haven't addressed that yet. So let's introduce a new method. We'll use set attribute, and the first argument is the attribute you want to set, and the second one is the value, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Of course, all these methods are chainable, so it's perfectly fine to just chain that method right onto the constructor of the text field. Now, because the comment form method is public, we can just call it right on our template. So let's replace all that static markup and refresh the page using the $comment form variable. Okay, this looks pretty awful. There are still a number of modifications we have to make for a form to keep in line with the markup that the designer provided. So I'm going to use add extra class to the form fields, and we'll add all those form control classes that we need. And then I'll use the set button tag on the form action. That makes it use a button instead of a input tag. I'll also use set extra class on that so we can get the correct colors. So let's refresh and see if that made a difference. Looks a lot better now. So that's okay, but this is getting kind of verbose, and I'd like to see if we can tighten it up a little bit so that all the extra classes and placeholders are added dynamically. So form methods, just like form field methods, are chainable. So we can chain the add extra class to the constructor of the form. That just saves us one small line of code. But we'll also step into this loop here and get all the fields. And in each iteration, I'm going to add the extra class form control, and I'm also going to set the placeholder value dynamically based on the field name. So this is mostly just a demonstration of form methods. You probably wouldn't want to do something this aggressive in your project code because this wouldn't really scale very well. Imagine if we had a new field come along that wasn't required, and that one doesn't need an asterisk now. That just makes things more complicated. Sometimes it's okay to be verbose and repeat yourself a little bit. You'll be glad you did when you have to make a small update further down the track and handle these edge cases. You won't be dealing with all this code that does everything automatically. So some of you Bootstrap fans might be a little dismayed about having to manually add all the basic requirements for Bootstrap. Rest assured, there is a Bootstrap Forms module that automatically does all this stuff. We haven't talked about modules yet, so it's a bit out of scope for this lesson, but be aware that this is more complex than it needs to be right now. So now we have our form. We need a comment to create with the form. So when a user submits a comment, we want it to save to the database and add it to the page. So before we go any further with forms, we're going to need to do some data modeling to store all that content. This should go pretty quickly because we've already covered this pretty extensively in the last couple lessons. So here's our article comment data object. And notice that we do have that has one back to the article page because every page has many comments, and the comments themselves have one page. And to the article page, all we're going to do is add a has many to article comment. We'll run dev build, and we see that we get a new table. Now, while we're in here doing some of the work on the model and it's fresh in our minds, let's just carve up the template and add a loop for the comments. There are no comments right now, but there will be shortly, so don't expect this change to really do anything. I'll just step into a loop for comments. I'll leave the image there of the man. We haven't dealt with avatars yet, so I'm not sure if we'll keep that or not, but that looks okay for now. And in the comment, I'm going to add the person's name, the creation date, and the comment itself. So I'll refresh the page, and like I said, the expected result is that no comments appear. All right, now let's handle the form submission so we can actually start creating these comments. Looking at our form method, the name of the handler we've specified is handle comment. So let's create that method. A lot of developers like to have their handlers right below their form creation methods. It just helps you find things faster. So in this handler, we're going to optimistically create the article comment object as our first operation. And we can do this because at this point, the form has already passed validation. So we know that all the required fields are in the data array. You may not always want to do this. You might have some logic that determines otherwise based on the values provided, but let's just keep it simple for now. Notice that we create that has many relation by binding the comment back to the article page. That's an easy step to forget. Remember that the has one fields are always suffixed with ID. So this ID, in this case, refers to the current page ID. All the properties of a page, such as title, content, and ID, those are all available in the controller as well as in the model, thanks to Silverstripe's Model as Controller class. So let's try submitting that form now and see what happens. And we get this error. Comment form is not allowed in article page controller. We'll get to the error in just a moment, but right now I think it's important to understand where we are and what we're really looking at here. Take a look at the URL. The first two segments of the URL are easily identifiable. It's the URL of our current article page, travel guide / sample article 1. The last part, comment form, is what's called a controller action. By default, the URL part that immediately follows the page URL will tell the controller to invoke a method by that name. So in this case, we want to invoke the comment form method in our controller to execute because it creates the form object, which is then passed along to our form submission handler. This right here is where most of the magic of forms happens in Silverstripe. They actually submit to a URL that recreates them as they were rendered to the user. You may have noticed that I casually mentioned an alarming detail of request handling in Silverstripe, and that is that you can invoke arbitrary methods in the URL. You can exhale. It's not that simple. In fact, the reason why it's not that simple is why we're seeing this error. You can't just execute arbitrary methods from the URL. The method that you execute has to be whitelisted using a static variable known as allowed actions. So let's add that allowed actions array right now. And I'm going to add comment form to that list. So we've made a change to a static variable. We have to run flush. So let's do that. And we're going to do that back on the article page because right now we're kind of in limbo here. We're sort of halfway through a form submission, so it wouldn't make very much sense to run the flush there. So now we run the form submission again, and we do see that our comment posted. All right, let's take this a step further. We've talked about how forms are first-class citizens in Silverstripe. Part of that is being model aware. So looking at our handler method, we can see that all the form parameters are named exactly the same as the article comment database fields. So this is ideal because it means we can take advantage of a massive time-saving method in the form class known as save into. So let's modify our function to call save into instead of manually assigning all the form values. So notice that we still have to manually assign the article page ID field since that field is not present in the form data. We could have passed it via a hidden input, and that would eliminate this line of code. So what's great about this method is that it can actually respond to the needs of a specific model. If our article comment object had a method called save comment or save name or save email, it could save the form data in its own specific way. So this may look like kind of a shotgun approach, but this save into method can actually be pretty granular if you want it to be. So our form is now accepting submissions and working as expected. So let's add a bit of validation. We're already using required fields, which is our primary sentinel against bad data. But what if we want to add some custom logic that goes beyond simple sanity checks like that? If the logic were really complicated, we could write our own validator, which we'll cover in the future. But for simple validation, it's fine if you do this all in your form handler method. So let's run a check to make sure the user's comment hasn't already been added. You might think of this as really basic spam protection. So before creating the comment object, we first inspect the data array to see if everything looks right. We look for a comment on this page specifically that contains the same content, and if so, we add a message to the top of the form. This scalar value bad is as the second argument gives it an appropriate CSS class. You can also add good as another option here that will add a success message. Now, to filter out false positives, we want to make sure the comment is at least 20 characters long. It is plausible that multiple readers might have the same comment, like nice article or good work, so we don't want to punish those users. It's unlikely that something greater than 20 characters would be the same, though. The chances get exponentially low of that happening. So again, just to reiterate, the lesson here is not about spam protection, but how to handle form validation. Do not accept this as gospel on how to secure your blog comments. It most likely is not the best way. So let's try submitting the form again with an existing comment, and you see that we do get an error message. There is one usability problem here, and perhaps we shouldn't worry about it too much since we're not particularly motivated to be nice to spammers. But for the sake of teaching the concept, it would be nice if the form saved its invalid state so that the user doesn't have to repopulate an empty form. So for this, the convention to use is the session state. So I'm going to create a SKU based on the form name to use as a session token, and we store that data array in there. If everything checks out, we clear it so that the form renders clean on the next page load. If not, we want the form to render the session data. So I'll go back to my comment form method. So using the ternary operator, we can look to see if the data exists. If it does, we return the form with the data loaded into it using its loadDataFrom method. If the data doesn't exist, we just return the form as is. Remember, most form methods all return the form object itself, so it's okay to return the result of loadDataFrom here. Let's test out our form again and see that it now preserves its state after the validation fails. Okay, that's all for this tutorial. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.